thanks. Okay, thanks for coming, everybody. I guess, look, I've got a lot of slides to go through today. I tend to have too many slides, and I'm going to probably flick through many of them quite quickly. I just wanted to talk about the subject of what I'm doing. Actually, I'll just go back to the first slide here. I'm actually using the historical account of Zhou Daguan, who visited Cambodia in the 13th century. He was a Chinese emissary. What I'm going to show you today is how my background is 3D animation, 3D modeling. That's what I teach at Monash, but long ago I did an undergraduate in archaeology. It's a long story about how those two came together, but what I'm very interested in is, I guess, using these technologies to look at historical accounts and see how we can model certain scenes from the past. Not so much precise moments in time that are given there, but just using lots of other information from other sources, as I'll show you today. I guess my field of work is, it kind of bleeds over into documentaries, but it also bleeds over into virtual worlds. Really what I do, the modeling that I do, is very close to computer game technology. I will show you some animations. Those are one way of visualizing or publishing this world inside, but also show you some other ways that it works. Okay, so a little bit about Zhou Daguan to begin with. For those of you who aren't familiar with him, his account of Angkor is extremely valuable. It's often referred to by historians and archaeologists because it's the only eyewitness account of Angkor that survives. We have other written accounts from Angkor, well, sorry, not accounts, but written information, inscriptions, for instance, but no other accounts from travelers, especially seeing it from foreign eyes, through foreign eyes. He seems to have spent a lot of his time at Angkor within the walls of Angkor Thom, probably not far from the palace. He wrote his account some years after his visit. A lot of historians believe that many of the chapters have been lost. We have a number of chapters still, but some of them have been lost, and that they're copied and recopied through the centuries. Many of the passages have been lost as well. Some caveats about his accounts, I guess. Well, the first one is, it's very apparent in what he chooses to describe as an educated Chinese gentleman of the time, and the way he looks at the barbarians and their habits and cultures. A lot of the material he reports is probably based on hearsay that he was circulating around the Chinese quarter at the time. However, for me, his account is profoundly visual. It's a very good source for modeling and animation because Zhou Daguan mentions a lot of very specific things like colors and costumes and locations and characters and memorized events. And a lot of these things he did see firsthand. I'm going to try and outline how computer visualization can address some of these. Just to let you know, I'm not going to show all of Zhou Daguan's accounts. I'm just really talking about certain excerpts. Some pictures to begin with here. You have a picture of Angkor Wat, which was what a lot of tourists would see as you walk in along the causeway and perhaps stop for a photograph in front of one of the ponds. Then you have an aerial shot of Angkor Wat here. There's the temple. You see the forest all around in the inner, in the enclosure here, and off to the distance you can see the West Barai, the huge reservoir. It's 8 kilometers long. And here again, this clump of forest, this is Angkor Thom, also forested. Interestingly, because these sites are still covered in forest, the archaeological remains beneath the forest has been very well preserved, and I'll show you what some recent developments have been in actually determining what is under that forest cover. But this image here from Ta Prohm, probably one of the most photographed locations in Angkor, and why I've put this here is because really conveys what Angkor is about in the Western imagination, at least in the popular imagination. It's a mysterious ruined city choked by jungle and vines. It's a dead city. I'm very interested in Angkor as the living city, what it was like as a functioning metropolis. I'm not the first one to deal with this area. There's some well-known paintings from the 1960 edition of National Geographic by Maurice Fivet. His scenes were based on Zhou Daguan's accounts. Here you have the king watching the New Year's celebrations, fireworks, and also you have the king in the audience hall in the gold window that Zhou Daguan describes. Also, documentaries, archaeological television documentaries have looked at recreating Angkor. This is here's an image of, well, an actor pretending to be Zhou Daguan. And behind him you have a CGI reconstruction of Angkor Wat. And again, here's the king, Indravarman. Interestingly, some of these documentaries, they come up with, there's mixed results. I mean, for instance, here you have the king appearing outside when Zhou Daguan says he was inside in a hallway. So another thing about these documentaries, there's been several of them over the years. These last one was from City of the God Kings. This one's from a slightly more recent one, 2009, by a German team. They use large teams of extras. They hire a lot of actors and extras and crowds on location. Here they're demonstrating Angkorian building techniques by rubbing stones together to produce a close fit. What I'm going to show you a little, so I can introduce my discipline here with 3D modeling. This is a very much speeded up version of how 3D modeling takes place. We don't use programming so much. It's a very tactile way of modeling things, very close to modeling with clay, a block of clay. This is how you'd make a human head. You start off with a block and then you subdivide it, you pull it, you stretch it, you squeeze it. The consistency of a 3D model is very much, is probably closer to chewing gum than clay. As you can see, it's a very editable, malleable plastic thing. So with my models, I can always go back and adapt them. If you make a model of a person, you can change that person into another person. You just duplicate it, you can change it into a different person. You can change the proportions of that person. Same thing with artifacts. You've probably heard of AutoCAD and how architects choose to model. That's also a 3D modeling technique. But I'm more involved in my discipline in what I call, I guess this is the traditional animation, but this is using 3D technologies. Here you can see inside this water buffalo there's a internal skeleton which moves the model around. Also, there's a great deal of other things I'm modeling in this project, and this is part of the broader research I've done in visualizing Angkor. There's other kinds of models that don't move. There's boats and carts. There's also these this is an areca nut palm here, and this is how a human model begins and how it's shaped. So you begin here with the cube, and then you kind of extrude it out to form a human figure. So how this works, I guess you can see here a model in motion of an ox cart, but you can see how all the musculature and everything bends and stretches. And for a model like that to work, you've got the internal skeleton, which is the cows are pulling the cart, which is bumping along, which is also making the guy in the cart bump up and down. So there's a kind of a flow through of physics as well. Okay, for modeling of architecture, this is where I just must make a quick distinction here. 3D is the word is being used more and more frequently. I guess you've got this phenomenon of 3D printing happening soon, and then 3D scanning. This is where heritage specialists at Angkor, this is Gapura here, they could stand in front of this with a laser scanner and scan the whole temple. It basically copies the whole temple into a 3D model inside the computer, right down to millimeters of accuracy, preserving all the tiny little cracks and fractures in the rock. Some models like this are far too complex for me to put into these animations, the visualizations I do. They're huge file size. For temples as well, there's a great many architects involved in research at Angkor who model temples very fastidiously. And if you've been to Angkor, you'll know how detailed these temples actually are. The ornamentation, the beveling of the stone. So the temples that I do, are much more, they're pared back and quite basic. I am, however, very interested in these village shrines, prasats, which were, there's hundreds of these throughout the Angkor area. A lot of them are just piles of bricks now. Some of them are better preserved, but these were the focal points of village communities all over the greater Angkor area. I am also very interested in vernacular architecture of Cambodia today, and historically, this is a historical photograph of the Siem Reap River area. And you'll notice the houses along the riverfront and how we actually translate these into 3D models. I'm sorry, would there be a way to get the rest of the lights off? The images will be a lot clearer. Sorry, it's just going to... Perhaps even that light there. Do I turn that off? Oh, that one? Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's clearer. Okay, so the basis behind a lot of these, I'm going to very quickly talk about landscapes because these are really the background to the accounts here. This is an archaeological map from the University of Sydney Greater Angkor project. So it's a team I work with quite a lot. What you have here are all these are rice fields, and you can see the embankments of the Western Beret there, and this is the corner of Angkor Thom. So with some of the visualization technology I've been developing, is that what I can do is I can get these maps, which are basically layers of information. They're like GIS, layers of information, layers of vectors. I can bring them into the computer and I can start to grow a landscape out of it. This is not a 3D image, but this is just showing you what some of the essentials of a Cambodian landscape around the Angkor area. You see the sugar palms, which are an iconic marker. But then looking closely at these trees, it's actually the case that a lot of the time there's just several species of trees. There's bamboo, there's pandanus. Here you can see pandanus along rice field edges. Bamboo, again, sugar palms. There's several other types of tree and other kind of landscape shots like this. I take a great deal of photography in Angkor. That's a lot of what I do every year. But just trying to determine perhaps the visual grammar of the Cambodian landscape. There's also things like rice fields. So if you're going to generate something like this in a virtual world, one way to do it would be look at every possible species and then model every possible species. But then if you just look at the key species that seem to be very prominent and repeat themselves a lot, you can model just those. So that's what we've done. So there's a lot of modeling of landscapes behind all of this. You can see here's the geometrical model here, and then the colored model. And taking the colors of the landscape as well, the hues and the grades of where edges are between, say, muddy paths and rivers or rice fields and roads, and putting this into a computer model. A small quote here to illustrate some of these, illustrate some of these landscape concepts and visualization. An archaeologist who works on the Mayan civilization, Elizabeth Graham, has talked about stone cities and green cities. She notes there's a kind of a lingering prejudice amongst historians and archaeologists regarding a city's relative evolutionary stage. A stone city, she writes, is one where mud, brick, or plaster dominates the landscape and creates dense clusters of houses and features. Green space is kept at bay. So the assumption here is you've got increasing social complexity, and then you've got increasing specialization, and agriculture is driven out of the city. Tropical cities are, by comparison, more enigmatic because they don't conform to these recognizable patterns, and because what Elizabeth Graham says, archaeologists cannot easily read what separates the built from the green. Angkor's definitely fits this pattern, and this is here's a 3D visualization of one part of Angkor Thom I've been working on, which I'm constantly updating. This is actually some work I did for a documentary a while ago. You can see people on the roads here, probably far too many people. But if we look at how many trees would be around a standard Khmer house or a Khmer garden, this is what the documentary actually liked, because you could actually see where the roads were and see where the houses were and see where the ponds were. But it probably wouldn't be this thick. It would probably more be like that. And that's extrapolating forward. If you look at not only historical information, but even contemporary layouts of Khmer villages, if you look off into a horizon, you'll see a lot of trees around. It looks like a forest or a wooded area, but in fact, those are usually where the villages are, under the shade. So, and gardens and houses will often have these trees around them for shade as well. Other kind of tests, you know, working on, these are, I guess this is visualization test. This doesn't feed exactly into the animation, but, you know, how things would actually, how an actual settlement would look. There's a prasat, a village shrine just there. So in a scene like this, you can actually see what's going on, but in reality, it's perhaps, you know, much more dense. Into Zhou Daguan's accounts, though. I'm just going to now illustrate how it is to model from historical accounts and how much is actually in any given excerpt. Here's an excerpt on dress, and Zhou says, "The men and women all wear their hair wound in a knot and go naked to the waist, wrapped only in a cloth. When they go out, they wind a larger piece of cloth over the small one." So this is how we have to model it. Okay, here's this is from Grolier, who did a wonderful study of interpreting the bas-reliefs at Angkor. It was published in the 1920s. This is the Sampot here, and this is our approximation of it in the 3D. Now, the difference here is that we have to make this actually move. It's not just a model. This Sampot actually has to bend and flex with the legs, which is one of the hard things to do in 3D modeling. I'll show you that it actually does create problems later down the line. Also, you've got all these illustrations of the women's dresses with all these flounces and tassels, and well, we went for a slightly more basic version here, again, because of the difficulties of animating all these things. But there is probably at least a master's or a PhD in getting these things into animation. Characters, I'm sorry these are so dark. Maybe I could, I know this is becoming like a movie, but maybe we could actually try and see if I could. Can you see that? Yeah. So I don't know if there's much I can do to fix that. Anyway, so about these, you know, that there's characters here. We're also dealing with tattoos on the bodies of these characters. These are really models of modern imagery, but Zhou Daguan does mention tattoos on people at Angkor, well, slaves in particular. Colors of the fabrics. This is from Gillian Green here, a fabric researcher at University of Sydney, and she gave me a couple of samples trying to determine what colors the fabrics were that these people that Zhou Daguan was seeing, and he mentions a lot of colors. But looking back, and these are from Gujarat, you can see these samples here. I use these as samples to try and determine what colors we could get on the fabrics. You see there's a lot of beige, there's a lot of red, there's indigo. There's not quite the range that we have today. That's much better, thanks. So looking at the bas-reliefs, we can also use some of these motifs that recur on the bas-reliefs with these you know, color samples and put these fabrics together. But before I show you any of these, I'm going to go on to a few other elements. Zhou Daguan talks about carts and palanquins. He says, the palanquins are made of pieces of wood that bend in the middle and point upward at either end. They are carved with floral designs and girdled with gold and silver. 1 foot down from each end of the palanquin is a hook nailed into the wood, and a large cloth folded is tied to the hooks with a rope. A person sits in the cloth and is carried by 2 people, one at either end. You can see on the bas-reliefs there's many representations of palanquins like this. But of course these bas-reliefs are obviously caricatured. The way they're, if we're going to model this precisely, or trying to use this as a guide, which we did, some of the things that 3D can do, or 3D modeling and animation can do is, well, we had to keep lengthening the top brace here, because the shorter it was, you can see how all these little elements here, these are simulated weights. So these 2 bearers, they're shouldering the burden of the palanquin, but it's also rocking as they walk. And these are all kind of flow-through things that happen. Some of these things you can automate in the animation process. If the bar was too short, however, the woman would keep falling out of the the hammock there. So that, I mean, I don't want to get too scientific about it, but these are some things we can look at. Okay, and you can see how this all fits together in a reconstructed scene. Another quote that's another excerpt that's very interesting is when Zhou Daguan talks about lepers. He also talks a lot about dysentery at, well, he mentioned dysentery at Angkor, but I'll just focus on lepers and leprosy here. He says, there are many lepers, they're everywhere on the roads, and local people think nothing of sleeping and eating in their company. So here, for an excerpt like this, if you're looking at modeling or animating from a historical account, looking at distinctions like being on the roads, you've got to try and extract something from this description. Does it imply that they're traveling on the roads as animated figures? Or, and there's also Zhou's observation that these were not obviously outcasts, or he didn't think that they were treated like outcasts in their society. We've got to kind of consider how you could demonstrate meaningful interaction there. But before that, of course, you've got to model a character with leprosy. So this is the model of the leper character here. It's just like any of the other human characters, but we've subtracted certain elements using historical photography. This poor guy doesn't have any fingers or toes, and if you notice the way that the animation flows through it, he can't balance. He cannot balance even in the virtual world. So we've given him crutches, and with that he can get around. These crutches are modeled on a reference I found of this man in Aceh with amputated hands and feet from the 1600s. So when we're putting these things together in a scene here, this is happening in the same scene. You've got, well, I've elected here just to have some lepers by the side of the road, and a man who might be familiar with them just stopping and sharing a drink and perhaps a short conversation. Now, can't really read too much into these now. All this happens very quickly. You'll see it fly past in only a few seconds. But I'm going to get, at the end of my talk, I will try to also show you how within these animated scenes there's actually a greater space than is belied just by the animated image. The Royal Palace at Angkor. Okay. When I first considered perhaps modeling this or trying to approach this with a publication, I thought there could be some easy ways to get around it. Zhou Daguan does, he mentions the palace several times, but he doesn't get into the inner areas. He admits that they were all closed off to him. He probably gets into the first enclosure area, which is where he has an audience with the king. This is an archaeological plan from excavations in the 1920s. This is the royal palace quite near the Bayon, near the center of Angkor Thom, but slightly to the north. What you can see here is moats around it. You can see these large ponds, the royal shrine at the center, which is also mentioned as a place where the king goes every night to meet with the snake goddess. And there's probably some large wooden buildings here, but archaeological excavations have been very inconclusive about this. Here's what Zhou says about it. He says, the royal palace, the officials' residences, and the great houses all face east. The palace is about 5 or 6 li in circumference. The tiles of the main building are of lead. All the other tiles are of yellow clay. The beams and pillars are huge and are all carved and painted with images of the Buddha. The rooms are really quite grand looking, and the long corridors and complicated walkways, the soaring structures that rise and fall, all give a considerable sense of size. So he's seeing it from the outside. To reconstruct from these excerpts, there's actually, I think there's several years' work in this, and also bringing in all the outside information you can bring to bear on this venture. However, reconstructions of the palace keep appearing in historical documentaries. You can see here, this is Day's City of the God Kings. The palace here looks almost Japanese, almost like a shogunate Japanese building. There's date palms, Middle Eastern date palms in the background. I think this is the Daguan, I'm not sure. Then, okay, another picture here is from a recent Korean documentary, which seems to lay out the palace pretty much like a temple, but without symmetry. There's no place for apparently not really anywhere for the king to live in here. There's no indication of where these soaring structures and wooden buildings were actually placed. Here's a bas-relief from the Bayon. It's hard to distinguish this in the image, but you'll perhaps notice some galleries of people seated here, and then another gallery here. Grolier thinks that this was a representation of the royal palace. And his sketch of this is what is, he's kind of copied down what he thinks was in the bas-relief and how it's assembled in the illustration. But this is how he thinks it was actually laid out. This is the drawing style, which is very much like medieval painting, about the perspective and how they're moving the front and the back and the sides together. At first glance, this might appear like it's got 2 stories, but in fact, Grolier is indicating that it's a single-storied residence, probably built, probably elevated a little bit, but there's 3 possible interpretations. This, so modeling the palace, I'm still working on that. It's going to take a little longer. I'm waiting for some new information to surface, and I'll show you soon that there's information from what's called a Lidar survey. One solution, though, just while I try and dodge the question, might be, because we're animators, is to show scenes of Angkor at night, as it was for half of its history. This is a test we've done of a festival along the causeway at Angkor Wat. The moon is entirely in the wrong position. It's not meant to be in that position at all. It's only there as a kind of an aid to light the scene. But I'll come to this in a second. Because there is a scene that Zhou Daguan describes, which takes place in the evening, and this is the New Year's festival at Angkor. He says, a large stage is set up in front of the royal palace and is hung everywhere with globe lanterns and flowers. Facing it on a bank more than 200 or 300 feet away are some tall structures that are made of wood and joined and bound together, like the scaffolding used to make a pagoda. They must be well over 200 feet high. Every night they put up 3 or 4 of these and set out fireworks and firecrackers on top of them. The various provincial officials and great houses take care of all the costs. The fireworks can be seen 100 li away and make enough noise to shake the whole city. So here again is it's a wonderful scene for animation. It also takes place in the evening, which means for the time being we could. The final thing about it is it's more or less it's more or less one of the only scenes that Zhou describes where we can give a pretty precise position of where he's talking about. He's talking about the Terrace of the Leper King. He's talking about the royal grounds in front of the palace, which are still there today. But back to these elements of how we model from these excerpts. Well, when Zhou's talking about the scaffolding, there's examples of scaffolding like this at Angkor today when they're restoring the prasats. And a lot of my archaeologist colleagues think that this is probably pretty similar to the scaffolding that was used to actually construct the prasats. We can put this scaffolding together in a scene here with the sunset behind it. And what you see here is a very vague outline of the palace. And unfortunately, it really is very dark on this screen here. But so I guess what I'm getting at is I can show a scene in front of the palace, but by choosing to place it at night, I don't actually have to deal with the palace until I've finished working on the reconstruction, which is going to take a little longer. What's more interesting is perhaps what fireworks would have looked like at that time. So fireworks here, some early images of fireworks. This is Hiroshige, and this is an illustration by Delaport of fireworks on the Mekong. That's just a small village festival. What was more interesting is what I found last year is the Banbang Phai festival in Isan. I just came across this quite by accident doing internet searches, but I was very intrigued not only by the size of these are the rockets here. You can see there's a person climbing the ladder, the size of the rockets here, but also the towers that are still used to launch these fireworks seem to me very close to what Zhou was describing. And there's the internet is replete with YouTube's videos of these things going up. They really do go off like anti-aircraft missiles. They go up to a mile up in the air. They don't seem to explode though. They just go up very high distances. So again, I mean, it's an example of new information surfacing that would kind of help to determine how I might review this scene. And I'll show you these animated scenes at the end of the, when I've got through these slides. Something else that is interesting is a precise date that Zhou gives. When he's talking about what he witnessed is the festivities preceding a Zhentan ceremony. He was there on the night, he saw the festivities taking place, but then he goes into rumor and hearsay about what he thinks actually happened afterwards. I'm really concerned with just the date here. I'm using the Harris translation for a lot of these excerpts. The date of the 29th to the 30th April 1297 is what Zhou says was early on the 6th night, the 4th month of the year Dingyu in the Dade rain period. And he says, on a Zhentan night, up to 10 or more families from a single alley may be involved. On the streets, people are out meeting Buddhist monks and Taoists, going this way and that, and the sounds of drums and music are everywhere. So common, just easily available astronomical software, you can plot where the moon was over Siem Reap on that night and how strong it was. It would have been visible all evening until it set, and it wouldn't have been quite a quarter full. So at least I have a kind of an indication of how bright the moon was on that night. What else is interesting is this is new information that's come out from this is the Lidar survey of Angkor. If you remember in the earlier slides I showed you Angkor Wat. The enclosure of Angkor Wat was heavily forested, and so was Angkor Thom. And Lidar is called light detection and ranging. It's a laser scan that you do. This is actually attached to a helicopter. They flew back and forth over Angkor. And what it can do is it can look under heavy trees and see archaeological information such as mounds and depressions in the ground. And this is the Royal Palace area here. So this image was supplied to me by Damien Evans. It's from the Calc Consortium. But here's the Royal Palace that I showed you before. What is, the red and orange are elevated areas and the white are depressed areas. But you can see these are previously not really known, but you can see outlines of alleys and trapeang ponds all around the Royal Palace area, including this very enigmatic area at the back here, which many people are still debating what that actually is. However, when Zhou's talking about the royal houses, the great houses all facing east, and when a lot of his accounts, he seems to. I'm not saying that he's exactly in this area, because there's more information to the south of this and to the east and the west of this as well, but it seems to be pretty close. And using this kind of information, I could use some of this to reconstruct perhaps one of those alleyways. When he talks about trade, he talks about when a Chinese man goes to the country, the first thing he does is take a local woman, partly with a view to profiting by her trading abilities. There is a market every day from around 6 in the morning until midday. Small transactions are paid for with rice, and large transactions done with gold and silver. So in modeling this marketplace that he talks about, we're really dealing with a kind of a shifting sea of humanity. This is, and I think one of the best references I found for this was a photograph of a market at Bali in the 1900s, which, although it isn't Angkor, and there's big differences between Angkor and Bali, I think is a photographic reference of what Angkor might have looked like in this marketplace. This is about as good as we could get. You see the women, various poses. Some are standing, some are sitting, quite crowded. And then how we map this out into a virtual world with all these little cubes, those are kind of proxies for where human figures would be. We can also use as another reference this very well known relief from the Bayon, which often appears in history books and guidebooks to Angkor. What you have here is what a lot of people think are Chinese merchants haggling with these two seated women, and then behind them, or perhaps at the same time, or perhaps in front of them, we're not sure with the perspective, you see all these men gathering around these two roosters and goading them into a fight. So in modeling these scenes, we're looking at this, at how such a scene from a bas-relief could be transferred into a virtual world. Back here in this area, happening at the same time, but unseen in this scene, are all the figures crowded around here. So this is all happening in the same space. Okay, very quickly, I'm going to try and wrap up with the last few slides before showing you some of the animation. Boats. Okay, I won't read all of this out, but what Zhou's describing here is the small boats, which he says are hollowed out by chiseling. They basically seem to be dugouts. They're large in the middle and pointed at either end. When I first modeled this scene with I have two graduates who helped me model, we couldn't really find any reliable references of a dugout in Cambodia. Some people I've talked to recently are going to supply me with some better pictures, but of course we used this boat here is really from historical photography. However, at Levec, near Levec, just this year I found some of these dugouts which were from sugar palm trunks. So the point I'm trying to illustrate here is there's a lot of elements of these animations which I can come back to and fix up with new information. These are not, I'm soon to do this, but I haven't yet published any of these. Other scenes that might be ahead, there's quite a few from the excerpt. I've shown you a few, but there's Zhou talks about savages. There's an excerpt here which I would like to try and deal with in a future animation. He's talking about people who know how to deal with certain savages. They know how to deal with people. They're sold as slaves. He talks about another kind, which I haven't included here, who weave together a very unusual looking kind of cloth and live further out. And then he says there's another kind as well who seem to be dwelling like hunter-gatherers and cannot speak in words. I'm very interested in seeing how I could put this into a short animation. Also, talking about slaves, when they run away, they're caught. A dark blue tattoo would be on their face. I'm very interested in how this could actually look. The iron shackle around their neck or between their arms and legs. And this scene, landscape, where he talks about coming to Angkor on his journey from up the Mekong. He's And then he talks about birds and animals making a ride of sound in the dark, shadowy forests with their old trees and tall bamboo. So these are all scenes that could be coming up quite soon. To finish up, I guess I'd like to just talk about the aesthetics of animation. I've done this little chart here where I've got The Simpsons at number 1 and King Kong at number 6. And really, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is where this virtual Angkor I have sits in this scheme. Animations are often known for caricature and satire. The Simpsons, for instance, here, simply drawn really for comedic effect. Then we get into different kinds of ways of drawing animations. This is Ghost in a Shell, a Japanese anime, slightly more realistic, but not quite. And then The Sims, a popular computer game, which you might have heard of. I think a virtual Angkor would sit about here, not in the middle, but just towards the slightly more highly realistic end. Up here we have another modern computer game, Assassin's Creed, which is almost photorealistic, and then finally King Kong. We should remember that King Kong is a 3D animated character, and he's realistic enough that you can put live actors in front of him and they'll be very convincing. I'm very happy with things being in this realm here. Obviously not caricature, but not exceedingly realistic. I think it's a good space. With the virtual Angkor animations we've developed, they're believable, but they're still obviously computer generated. I'd like to keep them there, and for certain reasons. The main one being that to make something very realistic, it's just very hard to do. It takes a lot of time, and we're constantly going back and readjusting things, fixing things. New information comes to light. I guess the other reason is that, with something that's believable but obviously computer generated, I think that gives students and researchers perhaps an ideal theoretical space to kind of play with different hypotheses of history. Well, historical excerpts with historical spaces, and test to see how these models can force assumptions to be made more precise. I think I'll like to finish there. I think I'm over time. Thank you very much. Yep.